Okay, I guess we'll get started today. My name is Theresa Severance. I'm a professor of sociology and criminology and also the chair of the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, Criminology, and Social Work. Today I will be talking about prison-based gerrymandering and also felony disenfranchisement. These are generally not terms that roll off the tongue. They are not terms that work their way into the everyday life of most people. For some reason, we've been hearing a lot about felonies and voting and rules in different states this election cycle, and I will try to address these issues throughout the presentation. I also encourage any questions that might arise throughout the presentation as well. So why present on these issues? What's the emphasis? Disproportionately, these are practices that have an impact on marginalized communities, particularly Black Americans, and they also undermine our democratic principles, right? We have philosophies of, everyone has a right to vote. We've had a long history of individuals and groups fighting for those rights over time. And we will also look at how we compare in a worldview. So what does voting for individuals who have involvement in criminal legal systems, what does that look like across the globe? So one of the questions that I have been hearing about, maybe you have too, this is a completely hypothetical example of how someone convicted of, for example, many felonies in a state such as New York, how would they be eligible to vote in a home state in a different part of the country, such as Florida, right? And one of the practices that might come into play when we are trying to address this question is the practice of prison-based gerrymandering, right? Anyone ever heard of prison-based gerrymandering? Know what that refers to, right? So great, this is an opportunity to learn something new today, which is what we're all striving for in this series in the current week. So this is a quote from Brent Staples. This appeared in the New York Times in a series called The Census. This particular segment was called Phantom Constituents, and this is from 2009. And he said there are many ways to hijack political power. One of them is to draw state or city legislative districts around large prisons, and then to pretend that the inmates or the people who reside in those facilities are legitimate constituents, right? That they should be treated, or that they are treated rather, the same as everyone else. We see that this is not the case in the vast majority of the states across the U.S. I'm not a political scientist, but I will give you kind of a nutshell summary of what redistricting is, right? So congressional districts across the country are proportional based on population counts, right? That we want to have a fair and even representation of constituents in a given state, for example. Every 10 years, districts across the country are redrawn following the national consensus. So the U.S. Census Bureau, as we know, takes a census of all individuals living in the United States every 10 years. How that information is handled with regards to prison populations and districting is state dependent. So each state has its own rules to determine who is in charge of redistricting and how that might be done. Some examples would be a bipartisan committee. So this would be a committee at the state level made up of representatives from both of the major political parties who would come together and make recommendations for how districting should be done. It can also be done by a nonpartisan committee. So this could be an outside committee that is charged with the task of drawing districting lines according to the rules in a given state. In some states, the governor, as part of his or her executive power, can oversee and determine redistricting in a given state. And in elsewhere, this is done by the majority party leaders in a given state. So whoever holds majority power in that state has the discretion as to how redistricting occurs. Gerrymandering isn't limited to a prison setting, but that's the context that we're looking at today for the purposes of how criminal legal system involvement comes into play when we're talking about election issues. So gerrymandering can mean manipulating boundaries of an electoral constituency to favor one party over another. And I'm sure we have all seen examples in the news about different states making attempts to map out those boundaries in ways that might favor one group over another. And we have had some cases going to state courts to oversee this, and also with some federal involvement as well, all the way up to the Supreme Court to determine whether individuals are receiving fair and consistent opportunities within their drawn boundary. So this is a very simple way to explain gerrymandering in general. So if you have 50 people in a location and that's being divided into 5 districts, there are different ways to do that, right? So you can look at what the breakdown of political parties are within a given district. In this case, we're choosing the colors red and blue, right? So in a district with 50 people, you could draw lines in this first example to represent what that constituency looks like, right? So that is representing a majority of blue districts to reflect the majority of voters who would trend in that direction in a given location. Other ways of doing gerrymandering might be a more compact, but also an unfair way of doing that. So we can split lines differently. So in this particular situation, you can see we have 5 districts that would be majority blue districts and 0 red representation in that area. Is that a fair way of drawing a district, do you think? Is that fair? Is that fair? No, because it doesn't represent the majority of individuals or the breakdown of individuals in that particular area. Some states can be, or districts can be very creative in how these districts are drawn. You see kind of, squiggly lines that can be drawn in such a way to favor the minority representation in a particular district. And again, we have seen examples of this on the national level, primarily, but not exclusively, in southern states in the U.S. So there are different ways to create voting districts in a particular location. Some are perceived to be more fair than others. And again, depending on who has the authority or the discretion to draw these lines, we can have very different outcomes in terms of political representation. Prison gerrymandering is a situation that has been an issue for a very long time. For about 200 years, the U.S. Census has counted people in prison as part of that local population, right? Because the task of the U.S. Census Bureau is just to measure the number of people in a given location. So in Connecticut, what are some examples of communities where we see prisons in the state? Anyone have an example? What's a community in Connecticut where we see prisons located? Yes. Hartford Correctional is a jail, right? We'll talk about jail populations in a little bit. So that's a little bit different situation. It's a little confusing in the state of Connecticut because jails are part of the state system. So those boundaries are not as clear as we might see in other places. So that is a common question. But if we look north to Connecticut, places like Enfield, Connecticut, which we will talk about in a few minutes, there are several prisons in that area of the state. What does that area of the state look like without those prison populations? Right? Anyone been to Enfield, know what Enfield looks like? Right? It's a pretty rural community overall, right? So less populated than in our cities within the state, like Hartford, Bridgeport, New Haven, and so forth. During the 1980s and 90s, across the country, we had hundreds of new prisons that were built in rural communities, right? By building prisons in those communities, the way the census counts individuals, the prison populations in those rural communities help boost their overall population, and that can distort their representation politically, looking at how we apportion representation in the state. Prisons, hopefully this is not a surprise. It is an unfortunate reality that prisons disproportionately house people from urban communities of color, right? So people who are in prisons, the location of prisons, are not representative of that rural location, and it's also taking away individuals from being counted in their home locations, right? They're being counted where they are at the moment, but maybe not where they are spending the majority of their time throughout the period of the census, which would be every 10 years. Because individuals in prison cannot vote, with the exception of Maine and Vermont, the bodies of non-voting minorities inflate the political clout of voters in mostly white districts, right? So we are artificially inflating rural areas if we are including prison populations in that count. So what are some larger consequences of prison-based gerrymandering? Again, choosing to count people where they are incarcerated versus the communities they're coming from, right? when individuals in prison are deprived of the right to vote, they can't hold officials accountable, the officials who represent them, right? Why is that important? Yeah. Right, they're not only under government, sure, thank you.
Sorry. I was just saying that because prisoners are a very vulnerable group of people, considering the fact that they are under like federal or state laws overall, and everything they do is controlled by the government, so they should have a say in what those officials decide.
Right, and in the context of our criminal legal systems, we could argue that these are the people most affected by some of the laws that are being passed with this sort of artificial representation, if we are just looking at the populations as the U.S. Census counts them. This violates the one person, one vote principle that we hold so dearly in our country, right? That we're counting people, but we're not allowing them to have a say in that representation. And again, as you pointed out, these tend to be vulnerable populations that would have the most to lose or gain by some of the state-level decisions that are being made. As I mentioned earlier, when we look at the nature of imprisonment, depending on the type of facility that we might be talking about, these are transient populations. They're temporary. Every day, people are coming in and also leaving our correctional facilities across the state. Usually, depending on the length of a sentence, people are in their home communities for most of that 10-year period. Right? So they're not getting the representation that would be reflected fairly if they were counted in their home community, again, places like Hartford, Bridgeport, or New Haven. So this harms not only the individuals by depriving them of their representation and their right to vote, but it also harms their communities, right? Because we're removing eligible voters from the count in those typically more urban communities, right? And so this, again, not just harms the individual of losing their representation, but the larger community as well. We know that, again, not every community is impacted evenly by our criminal justice policies and what happens in our criminal legal system. So this harms communities without prison facilities by diluting their vote, right? We don't have a prison facility here locally in the community of Willimantic or Wyndham. So we might be placed at relative disadvantage to some of those communities in the state that do have one or more prisons located within their boundaries. And this can also impede criminal justice reform. Again, the people who tend to be most impacted, the communities that tend to be most impacted by these reforms are not having the representation or the say that would be fair if we counted individuals in prison a different way. And we do have different ways of doing that, as we will take a look in just a moment. So in Connecticut, this is a quote from the legal director of the Prison Policy Initiative. This is a nonpartisan organization located in Northampton, Massachusetts. They have been at the forefront of efforts to advocate for changes both to how individuals are counted as far as political representation, but also the rights afforded to individuals who have been convicted of a felony conviction, or of a felony, as we will talk about shortly. So all districts in Connecticut send people to prison, but only some districts contain prisons, right? So someone gets arrested in Hartford, for example, they're sent off to a more rural community, and they are counted as part of that population, even though they can't vote there. The majority white residents of 7 House districts in Connecticut historically have received significantly more representation in the legislature because each of their districts included at least 1,000 incarcerated African Americans and Latinos from other parts of the state. So again, this is an issue that has been around for quite some time, and fortunately, there have been steps taken to address some of these inconsistencies so that we have more fair representation. 86% of prison cells in the state of Connecticut are located in disproportionately white House districts, right? So we're looking at the populations, the local populations, in the communities where prisons are housed. So as I said, the Prison Policy Initiative, this map is credited to them, looking across the state and some changes that have happened or are in the process of coming to fruition as we try to tackle these issues nationally. So in states like Connecticut now, we have state laws that prohibit prison gerrymandering, right? The governor of Connecticut signed legislation in 2001, as we'll see in a moment, or 2021 rather, specifically addressing this issue. Some states are in process, right? They've passed resolutions, but those items haven't made it into law in those particular states. Within states, we also have movement. So some counties, cities, and school boards have confirmed that they have taken measures to avoid prison gerrymandering in their communities. We also have state laws that prohibit or discourage local governments from engaging in these unfair practices. And we have states that have introduced legislation abolishing prison gerrymandering. So we have developments on multiple levels. Some have solidified this into state law. Some states are still in progress, and in some areas there is much more discretion afforded to either state or more local officials in terms of how they use the census data. Yes?
So the previous slide, you have states that are white, that have nothing. What does that mean?
So these are states that haven't done anything yet, right? So overall minority of states, but geographically large states, most of them, some of them large states in terms of population, like my home state of Ohio. There are things being done at the very local level in terms of how counties or local communities are treating those populations, but not the state as a whole.
So my other question,
Yeah.
so we talk of state prisons versus federal prisons. Mm-hmm. So how does that apply here?
So this is only looking at state prisons, right? For the purposes of districting in a particular state, if that makes sense. So we do have a movement with more state and local governments rejecting prison gerrymandering, so they have taken steps to reduce unfair representation in this particular way. So as you can see in orange, in Connecticut, again, we are included here as a state that has ended or significantly limited prison gerrymandering, right? So they have taken decisive steps, and in the example of Connecticut, we have worked this into state law. In other states represented in lighter yellow, reform legislation has been introduced in the past. It either has not become state law or we see continuous changes. And again, even within those yellow states, more is being done at the local level. So we're not seeing consistency across the U.S. as a whole. Like a lot of things that have to do with our criminal legal system and how we treat these populations that are at a disadvantage, we don't see uniformity across the states. And we could add other layers of color over these maps to see what kind of overall trends we have in terms of how particular states or communities vote. And that could also have an influence on the decisions that are being made in a particular state. So what are some things that we can do to address these inconsistencies, right? The U.S. Census could change policy as to how they count people residing in prisons. They could choose to count those individuals based on their home address rather than where they are incarcerated. This has been proposed many times. To date, the U.S. Census has not taken up this issue, so they have continued to count individuals based on where prisons are located. States can also choose to create state-level census data, so they can determine for themselves how they plan to use that information. Again, Connecticut is a great example, a more recent example of a state that has taken that step. We can also eliminate some of these inconsistencies by allowing people in prison to vote, right? As I mentioned earlier, we have 2 states plus the District of Columbia and some of the U.S. territories allow people in prison to vote, and that eliminates some of the issues that have been brought up. So any questions so far about where we are with that? Okay. So again, to highlight what has been happening in Connecticut, as I mentioned, Enfield contains the town of Enfield in Connecticut, up in northern Connecticut, houses 3 prisons: Robinson, CI, Willard Cebulski, CI, and Enfield prison. And in 2010, the town of Enfield decided to exclude the populations of those prisons, right? So when they did a redistricting, they changed how they included the prison populations in those communities. After the 2010 census, Enfield concluded that there was no significant population change once they removed those populations. So they didn't need to redistrict, or they chose not to redistrict when they had the opportunity after that census. And so while Enfield technically didn't redistrict after the 2010 census, they chose to reject the Census Bureau's prison counts, and by doing that, avoided the problem of prison gerrymandering, which had been present in the state of Connecticut for quite some time. As I mentioned earlier, in 2010, Connecticut Governor Ned Lamont signed a bill ending prison gerrymandering within the state, and we became the 11th state to end this practice, right? So 11 out of 50 states, plus some territories, have taken that decisive step. We are still seeing large variations in terms of geographic locations and decisions that are being made. And some of these issues really become highlighted in climate where we are currently with so much division and projections of slim margins in some areas, not only within the state of Connecticut, but across the country. Right. A second issue that is relevant when we are looking at how involvement in criminal legal systems can have political consequences is the issue of felony disenfranchisement. Has anyone heard of this issue or this concept? Anyone know what that does? What is disenfranchisement? Yeah. Thank you.
It's like when you take away someone's right to vote.
Right. So in this case, taking voting rights away from someone who has been convicted of a felony, right? What's a felony? What consists of a felony? Right? That can vary a lot from one place to another. And charging decisions are very complicated. Right? So this is like a plate of spaghetti. There's a lot to untangle in terms of how this can happen, what it looks like in different places. So across the country, if we look as of 2022, we had 4.6 million Americans with a felony conviction who were disenfranchised. So they lost their right to vote depending on where they lived and where they were in terms of their individual case and sentence. And we'll look at some variations or what that means shortly. So we had reforms to expand voting rights to justice-impacted individuals, and this was done through a series of reforms, both administratively and statutorily through state law, that have come together with relatively modest declines in our prison population. So between those two things, some advances or some reforms in how we treat individuals who are justice involved and some declines in our prison population, we've reduced the number of individuals who were disenfranchised by about 24% since that reached its peak in 2016 when we really saw the height of prison populations in this country. It is, at least among my criminology students, fairly well known that as a country, our practices have led to mass incarceration. We, in the United States, make up about 5% of the world's population. Anyone know what portion of incarcerated people worldwide are contained in the U.S.?
10%.
That's a
10%?
good guess. It's actually higher than that. Yeah. It's about 25%, right? So this is something where we have a lot of people impacted, and this can have very large political consequences depending on, again, whether these are changes that are made at the discretion of a governor in a particular state, for example. Mm-hmm.
About that, you said 20%. Do we have a higher percentage because we can afford to do that? We have enough institutions, or is it because our laws are very strict?
I would propose it's because we have laws that are very strict relative to other places. We hear a lot of rhetoric, particularly, I think, in the current political climate, that the U.S. is very soft on crime, that crime is increasing, that some communities have decriminalized certain kinds of behavior in ways that are believed to be driving prison populations. And that simply isn't true when we look at not only crime rates across the country, but also, again, when we compare ourselves to other countries. 5% of the world's population, but about 25% of all the people who are incarcerated in the world reside in the United States. So we are a very punitive country and culture when we talk about how we respond to crime. So again, going back to our completely hypothetical example, questions arise of how someone could be convicted of many felonies in a state like New York. How would that person still be eligible to vote in their home state in a different part of the country, for example, Florida? Completely hypothetical example, right? The answer to that is it depends, right? It depends is a common answer to a lot of questions regarding our criminal legal systems, right? Every state determines for itself what happens within that state, how laws define different categories of crime, what kinds of sentences or sanctions are attached to particular kinds of crime, decisions that are made by the executive in a particular state. In our country, that would be the governor, for example. So there's a lot of variation between states, and that can cause a lot of confusion, not only among voters, but also election officials when we're trying to determine if someone is following the law and if they are exercising their right to vote legally versus someone who may not have that right, depending on laws within the state. This is, as far as I could tell, a most recent breakdown of how different states treat individuals who have been convicted of a felony. So in the extreme, over here on the right side, in states like Maine, Vermont, Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico, those states allow for voting rights for all, including people who are in prison. You can be convicted of a felony, you can be currently residing in prison in those states and territories, and you still retain your right to vote. That's pretty simple, and that is a very fair way of ensuring that individuals who have the right to vote are able to exercise that right. At the other extreme, we have 11 states, mostly, again, these are southern states for the most part, not all of them, that permanently disenfranchise individuals for either all or some people with felony convictions, right? So we have two very different things happening in different parts of the state.
So let's say I'm serving my time in Kentucky, but I'm from Vermont.
Right.
Do I get an absentee vote to vote for in the general election?
That should be the procedure. However, as we'll talk about in a moment, there are a lot of logistical barriers that make that very difficult. Even in states like Maine and Vermont, where a felony conviction does not prevent you from voting, the logistics of how you're able to do that, how you're able to exercise that right, varies on a lot of different circumstances that are beyond your control and maybe out of control of, in the immediate at least, of the state government or the Department of Correction, however that agency is titled in a given state. So, yes. Yep. So, let's see.
Louisiana.
So there are some exceptions within those states. These might have to do with things like individuals with certain offenses are excluded, homicide or murder convictions, for example, even though other people with felony convictions in the state might have the right to vote. If you have been convicted of specific felonies within that state, you can still be disenfranchised. It's okay. I love your questions. This has been great.
Well,
Yeah.
okay, it's on. When were some of these like permanent disenfranchisements like passed into law? Was that like during like maybe like the civil rights era, or and has it been permanent, or was it previous to that? Because when did they decide like?
That's a great question. Much of this goes back to post-Civil War, right? When we look at the reaction, particularly of southern states when slavery was abolished, there was still a lot of pushback in those states and a reluctance or defiance in terms of allowing previously enslaved individuals to have their rights recognized, as we saw with other individuals who were otherwise eligible to vote in those particular states. So this isn't a recent problem. It's something that has been around for a long time, but over that time, and in particular during the civil rights movement, we started to see some changes in how we treated those populations. But as you can see, there's still a lot of variation. So some states now, and Connecticut is in this category, and this was a recent change. The majority of states, 23 states, only disenfranchise during incarceration. So once you have left prison, you may be on parole, you may have reached your end of sentence while you were incarcerated, your right to vote is restored. That doesn't mean that it is done automatically. In some places, it's not an opt-out situation, it's an opt-in. So that means people know that they have the right to vote once they have left prison. It means they have the documentation that is needed to register to vote. And so even when we have taken steps to try to make things more fair in terms of how we treat individuals with legal system involvement, there are still barriers that lead to kind of de facto disenfranchisement. You know, if you don't know that you have that right, you may not be able to exercise it, right? You haven't taken the steps that would be needed for you to have that. Other states have made it easier so that, you know, this is automatically done when an individual is supposed to be done automatically when an individual leaves prison. And that is also based on the assumption that there's clear communication between the Department of Corrections, who's in charge of housing people, and the state in terms of, you know, their voter records and who is eligible.
So
Yes.
I have a question.
Yes.
If voting rights are very important to an individual,
Yes.
do we see a lot of migration from those states to other states that do allow you to vote, especially if you're living very close to the border of other states?
That's a great question. There can be legal barriers to allowing people to do that. You know, if you are on parole, for example, in the state of Connecticut, there are typically restrictions on your movement. You're not allowed to leave the state, you know, without permission. There are also structural barriers beyond the legal barriers. It's difficult for people who don't have a lot of resources, to be able to pick up and move to those communities where they would have more fair representation. And again, there's so much variation from state to state. You would need to really be informed about how those procedures work, having the opportunities to move to other states. And again, there are a lot of restrictions in how people can move around based on their legal status. If they have been convicted of a felony, whether they are still completing their sentence on probation or parole in the community, and what that might mean for a receiving state. So back to Florida, right? We like to pick on Florida a lot. So what about Florida, man? What's going on in Florida if we go back to our example? So in Florida authorizes voting for most citizens who have completed their sentence, but they have also paid their fines and fees that are attached to involvement in the legal system. And this was kind of another change. We keep raising the bar or including other caveats that will prevent individuals from having those rights fully actualized. So in 2018, Florida voters expanded voting rights for almost 1.5 million Floridians with a felony conviction. So this was an amendment to the state constitution, Amendment Number 4, that provided automatic reinstatement of voting rights for justice-involved individuals who had an eligible felony conviction. Again, eligible felony conviction means that there can be certain offenses that are excluded from that. And typically those are, murder or serious sexual assault cases. So persons who had a felony conviction, once they completed prison, once they completed felony probation, if that's the sentence they were given, or if they had completed parole with the remainder of their sentence in the community, they could automatically regain their right to vote. Again, with some exclusions. So in Florida's case, homicide and sexual crimes were excluded. The following year, in 2019, Florida lawmakers, not the individual, voters in the state that passed the amendment, but legislators in Florida passed, and their governor, Ron DeSantis, signed into law Senate Bill 7066, which restricted voting rights for individuals who had not paid court-ordered monetary sanctions. So if they had fees or fines attached to their involvement in the legal system, in some states, this may or may not be the case with Florida, but in some states, if an individual is behind in their child support payments, they can also be disenfranchised. So this has been compared to some of the practices that we saw in southern parts of the United States after the Civil War. Anyone know what some of those practices might have been? Yeah.
I think they did there were literacy tests,
Yep.
and I can't think of anything else right now.
Poll taxes.
Poll taxes.
Yep.
Grandfather clause, I don't know.
Right, so after the Civil War, with the abolishment of slavery, again, some southern states in particular were really hanging on to and very defiant of restoring or providing rights to individuals who had been previously enslaved. And so in the modern era, these are practices that have been compared to some of those early efforts to disenfranchise our marginalized populations, right? So why is this controversial? You know, we are in a country where, you know, the right to vote is held as being sacred. As we talked about earlier, we've had a lot of efforts, a lot of bloodshed over the past 200 years plus for everyone to have access to these hard-fought rights. But it still remains controversial, at least in some communities, or as some individuals might see it. So what are some arguments against disenfranchisement, right? Why should we be pushing for individuals to have the right to vote, even if they have been convicted of a felony? Any ideas? Yes.
I'm thinking of equal rights. If we are in the United States with equal rights, why would you allow somebody in Florida to vote and not somebody in Texas?
Exactly. And we see a lot of geographic variation in how these categories and individuals are treated. So this disproportionately impacts communities of color and also poor people, right? Because these are the people who are more likely to end up in our criminal legal systems, not because of who they are, but how some of the disadvantages that we have built into our laws and practices. I raised the question earlier in this talk, what is a felony, right? That can seem somewhat arbitrary when you look at some of the activities or behaviors and some of the harm that is caused. So for example, in the state of Mississippi, you could steal a fishing pole. If it holds a certain level of value, that could be a felony conviction. And you would lose your right to vote. But there are companies building cars where hundreds of people died. You know, Ford Pinto and some of the other corporate fraud and illegal practices that we've seen. But those rights remain intact, right? We tend to focus on so-called street crimes more than other kinds of harm that can be done to individuals also with behaviors or activities that are illegal, right? Is this the direction we want to go as a democracy, as a country that prides itself in fair and equal treatment, right? I would argue this isn't helping society, but it's hurting us, right? We're taking rights away from people in some parts of the country or some parts of the state and not others, without real regard to the actual harm that's being done, right? We also tend to have a non-voting problem in this country, right? A lot of people don't exercise their right to vote. It's not that we have people who are, you know, engaging in widespread in illegal practices to vote when they don't have the right to do that or in ways that would be illegal. This could also be, again, an issue of taxation without representation because, you know, how we count people in terms of voting, if we look at the gerrymandering issue or if we look at how we treat individuals who have been convicted of a felony, you know, they are engaging in activities, you know, they're paying taxes, whether it's sales tax, whether it is income tax, property taxes on their homes, but they're not having a say in how that is spent, right? How those resources are allocated. Yeah.
So I had a question.
Yeah.
Like, I know that in some prisons in some states, like Alabama, for example, like prisoners are they're allowed to work for corporations, and so like that would also be another good reason because like they're working for below whatever the federal minimum wage is, and I don't know
Right.
exactly the laws for that, but
Right.
I feel like that would be an important thing to note when they're not if they're not allowed to vote. Like, why are they allowed to work? Like, and why are they allowed to do that? I don't know.
Right, we tend to exploit the labor of individuals who are incarcerated.
I'm also wondering here because we have, as you mentioned, certain communities, they don't have these rights or they suffer more than other communities. And I wonder whether states that have changed their laws, they have a higher population of those communities because the votes have to come from the communities and the changes have to be initiated by the communities themselves.
Right. That's a good question. And there are a lot of what ifs within our systems that we still need to address. And there can be other both legal or administrative barriers that can come into play as well. In some states, the process to regain your right to vote might include appearing before the governor of that state and formally asking to have your rights restored. And that executive in that state has the discretion whether to grant you that right or not. Right? So that's placing a lot of political power in the hands of the executive without guardrails to protect how that's being done. Is that being done in a fair way, or are these decisions that are being made with extra legal factors involved? Not just that you've convicted a felony, but what you look like, what community you're coming from, and so forth. So there are still some populations, I would say, or some communities or groups across the state that are still pushing for felony disenfranchisement, that hold tight to the fact that, or the belief that individuals should not have the right to vote if they have been convicted of certain felonies, right? So historically, disenfranchisement is an example of what we call collateral consequences of a felony conviction. The idea that when you break the law, that you lose certain rights. What are some examples of those collateral consequences? So losing the right to vote in some states is one. There can be employment barriers. Right? Some communities will exclude people who have been convicted of certain offenses from, taking certain jobs, for example. Other rights, yes? Mm-hmm.
Rent or like buy a house,
Yep.
if you're a felon, that would be more difficult as well.
Right. There are federal laws about, having access to Section 8 housing, for example. Yes.
Running for office?
Yes. Yep. Again, this is state specific, and some states, they can allow someone with a felony conviction or for certain offices. For example, you could be a candidate and have felony convictions, and in other communities, that would not be allowed. Some people argue that so-called felons are not educated enough to vote, or that they don't show proper judgment because of the assumed decisions that people make that bring them into the prison system. Very little research has been done on the voting practices or preferences of people who are incarcerated. There is a notable example, I believe, in Denver. A few years ago, there was a survey done of incarcerated people in those jurisdictions to better learn about what voting meant to people who were incarcerated and how they might exercise that right to vote. And those responses were very diverse, just as we see in the larger community. There are a lot of assumptions about how people might vote based on that conviction, but that's not a given, right? There is certainly more variation, and it is, according to those studies, it is an important right that people want to exercise, right? Some might make the argument that you get your right back after you've served your time and gain your other freedoms back. But as we have seen, depending on state practice, state law, et cetera, that might not be the case. There are some states, a large number of states, where you can permanently lose the right to vote even before you reach the age of 18. If you are a young person who has been convicted of a felony, you can lose your right to vote permanently before you have even been old enough to exercise that right. So this can have long-ranging consequences, right? This is a quote from James Jeter. He helped found the Full Citizens Coalition to Unlock the Vote, which is an advocacy group here in Connecticut. And he said, restoring the right to vote is smart policy. It enables people who are incarcerated to feel connected to their communities, right? Connection is the opposite of criminality. The more connected people are to their communities when they are having a difficult time, when they have been to prison and they're coming back out into the community, the more connected people are to that community, that is a protective factor in terms of criminality. People are less likely to violate the law when they are feeling connected to their community. And there are studies that back that up, that having the right to vote, being able to practice the right to vote, is associated with lower levels of reoffending for people who have been in prison. In Connecticut, no one is disenfranchised for misdemeanors or other convictions besides felonies, right? However, you can be in jail in Connecticut for certain misdemeanors or for convictions other than felonies. In those cases, again, it becomes a matter of logistics. Are you able to exercise that right while you are confined? And some of those are ongoing issues. There have been some efforts by Stephanie Thomas, who is our Secretary of State here in Connecticut, to try to address those issues, to make sure that individuals who are eligible to vote, even though they are confined in places throughout the state, that they are able to exercise that right. Even if you have been charged with a felony, but you haven't been convicted, you have not lost your right to vote. But if you are sitting in jail on election day, and you haven't had the opportunity or the foresight to complete an absentee ballot, whether able to exercise that right is a question. Right? And finally, we want to look at, how this compares to the rest of the world, right? We are one of the few places across the globe that denies people the right to vote due to criminal convictions. That is only used in narrow and rare circumstances in other places. But in a country that locks up more people than any other place on earth, we are depriving those individuals of rights much more so than we see in other countries across the world who allow citizens the right to vote. Any questions? kind of wrapping up. Okay. So an overview of some of these issues. Again, I hope this sparks some interest that you will take a look at or reach out to some of the resources out there. Get the word out to individuals who you may know who have been in prison or convicted of a felony that in the state of Connecticut, they do have the right to vote, right? And that they should have the ability to exercise that right. But when people don't know, or we make that process difficult, then we, again, are in practice disenfranchising those individuals and not having free and fair elections within our borders. Any other questions? All right, thank you.